Good afternoon, everybody. Thanks for joining us. We're just going to give folks a couple minutes to filter in and we'll get started about 1:35. Those of you who are just trickling in, we're just giving folks a couple minutes to get into the meeting and then we'll get started. Probably 2 minutes. Okay, we're going to get started. There's lots of information to get through, and I want to be respectful of everybody's time. So thank you again for joining us this afternoon. This webinar is about the 9 new mandate letters that were released over the last few days. Benazir and I will walk you through what we've learned. Next slide. For those of you who aren't familiar, I am Eileen. I'm the director of the nonprofit voluntary sector. I manage the government relations portfolio for the nonprofit sector. Benazir, I'll let you introduce yourself.
Hi everyone, I'm a student at law here at Alberta Council. Here's just a little bit about me. I did my Bachelor's of Science and Bachelor's of Commerce at the U of A, and then went on to get my law degree from the University of Saskatchewan. I am really interested in access to justice, and these are some of the things that I worked on while I was in law school. And after finishing my articles, I will be commencing a judicial clerkship in Ottawa at the Tax Court of Canada. So I'll proceed on to the presentation now.
Okay, so we got a slew of new mandate letters, 5 of which came at about 3:30 yesterday afternoon. Remember that when we're going through this, there was the ministry shakeup. So immigration was subsumed into Ministry of Jobs, Economy and Trade, and then childcare has been moved from CFS to education. So when we're doing a comparison between 2023 and 2025 mandate letters, that won't necessarily be as clean cut as we would like it to be. Also an interesting note, the JEDI, ACSW, Forestry and Parks, and the Tourism and Sport mandate letters were released under the banner of economic resilience, and then the remaining 5 were labeled under the stronger services banner. So as we go through this, we're going to provide some really high level information on what the mandate letters say, and then we're going to note key differences between last year, or the 2023 mandate letters, and this year's mandate letters. So we'll start with the Ministry of Arts, Culture, Status of Women. They're to work with JEDI to grow Alberta's cultural industries. The idea here is to promote and celebrate Alberta's unique cultural identity and heritage, including identifying opportunities to more prominently display our provincial flag and motto across the province, while significantly growing the size and scope of Alberta Day celebrations. They want to continue working with First Nations throughout the province that wish to repatriate items identified as belonging to their nations, including the implementation of the new repatriation framework. And then in cooperation with CFS, continue to develop and implement supports for victims of violence. The key differences here in 2023, the mandate letter had a strong emphasis on anti-racism legislation, multicultural consultation councils, cultural holiday recognition, and inclusion programs. It kind of framed arts and culture in terms of diversity, integration, and equity without using those terms, obviously. In 2025, we've seen a significant shift here to a much narrower focus on heritage promotion and symbolic provincial identity. Cultural industries are now linked to economic growth, not just diversity. Gender-based violence remains a through line, but with less emphasis on broad equity program. Social supports are still important, but the specific long-term plans are less front and center, and there's still no solid place for the nonprofit sector as a whole. ACCSW is often considered the home for the nonprofit sector, but you'll see here, it's very specifically focused on key subsectors of the nonprofit sector. Next. We will send out the slides and the recording after the presentation is over as well, so don't worry about us going through this too quickly or whatever. We'll make sure that you have the information, but this is just a really high level overview of some potential risks and tensions that we might see in the coming year. With a focus on provincial identity, we've seen some identity clashes here over the course of the last year. There might be some struggle there. Could be some underfunding, overlap of responsibilities between ministries, which we will continuously see. And then there could be some legal conflicts between museums, universities, and Indigenous nations over cultural items. So Ministry of Forestry and Parks, we're still looking to expand public access to natural spaces while protecting the environment. There's a real focus, a heavy focus on wildfire mitigation through federal partnerships, strategic harvesting, fire smart programs, and new technologies. A lot of this is coming out of the Jasper fires and the tension that came out from that management of that disaster. The idea here, we're still looking at, increasing campsites, accessibility, expanding trails, and implementing the Resort Act. Sorry, I'm blanking on the name. And then we're also looking at developing a value-added tax incentive for forestry products. Key differences here. There's still a focus on expanding tourism and recreational activities with value-added taxes, incentives, and expanding campsites, but there's a stricter emphasis on wildlife mitigation and prevention. That's the key change. Most of the rest of it still kind of, the themes remain the same. JEDI is dense. This was a heavy mandate letter here. And so we've got 4 key categories: immigration and labor market, which is focused on stricter provincial control over international immigration, with a focus on economic migrants that will boost the economy. We're looking at less temporary foreign workers and ensuring vacant jobs are prioritized to young Canadians. We've got jobs and skills strategy, which is emphasizing again the focus on improving youth employment and implementing strategies to develop job-ready skills, understanding labor market needs and tailoring employment opportunities towards those in need, co-developing a talent pipeline with employers to meet labor market needs, investing in short-term responsive training programs, and then improving productivity via workplace supports, including the Canada-Alberta Productivity Grant. Investment in competitiveness. We've got maintain Alberta as a leading destination for investment, both domestically and internationally. Increase annual investment and growth fund allocation to 50 million. Review existing provincial tax incentives and potentially remove them, altering them and tailoring them to the province's current needs. Important to keep that in mind, especially as we have a $6.5 billion deficit going into this next budget. And then looking at expanding federal and private investment in defense-related industries and infrastructure. And finally, the trade and global engagement. We're looking at defending Alberta's interests in federal trade agreements. This is a continuous theme throughout all of the mandate letters. Supporting business diversification into new global markets, expanding international trade missions, and then improving airport connectivity and direct international flights. Benazir and John, if either of you have anything to add, feel free to dive in.
Sure, Aileen, maybe I might just for a second. Can you hear me okay? Sorry, I'm John. I'm one of the principals at Alberta Council, and I think we've covered the first two fairly well. There is this shift from that first year and a year and a half of government where we're looking at ideological pieces into movement and motion. And so it's a continued focus on actual program development and the exercise of some of those things that would have formed in the last platform. So as we go through this, keep that in mind that we've gone from finding things and getting things organized over across under the dome to okay, how are we going to exercise on these? And so you're going to see an operational shift. And so that shift in direction and attitude comes basically from ideological bases to start with into practice as we move forward.
Great. Thank you. So to that point, some key differences here, noting the shift in direction and attitude. But 2023 under immigration and labor, there was a focus on addressing workforce gaps, speeding up credentialing, specialized streams, that sort of thing. We saw some success in that in the interim years. Youth employment was not a direct priority. Focus was on general labor shortages. It was identified, youth employment was identified a couple times in business ministry plans and that kind of thing. But it was not as specific of a priority as we see in 2025. Now in 2025, under immigration and labor, we've got strong provincial control over immigration, the prioritization of economic migrants, focused on labor market integration and less emphasis on the inclusion and social supports. And then we've obviously got that explicit focus on youth hiring incentives and reducing barriers to youth employment. So the general theme here, you've got from broad workforce inclusion to targeted economic driven immigration management, and then from general workforce strategy to direct investment in youth employment. And you'll see that as an example in the newly released youth employment program that the government just announced.
With some continued friction that I think you're going to see between the feds and the Fed program on immigration and labor, and the ability for the province to want to step in to that lane on everything from economic and labor market opinions to how they can continue to cater to the local Alberta base specifically. And with that shift to youth employment also, and you'll see this pop up in education and training, a focus that has alternative youth employment through things like trades, through alternative education programs outside of the post-secondary sector.
We've split this chart into a couple slides because it's very long. So here's kind of some of the other broad categories that we're looking at for changes, but there's still in 2023 for incentive programs and investment, we're looking at reducing red tape and attracting investment in forestry and manufacturing while supporting the local industry. In 2025, we're looking at reviewing and optimizing existing programs, expanding growth funds, and then aligning incentives with long-term goals. So there's a change in attitude here from building and experimenting to measuring, refining, and scaling. And then under trade and global engagement, we've got in 2023, this was minimal mention. It was more focused on inwardly. I would suggest that a lot of this outward focus is in partial response to the tariffs and trying to diversify our economy here and our markets. And so in 2025, we see a strong outward focus, obviously still defending Alberta's interests in the federal landscape, but also looking to expand into global trade markets and using trade missions to grow those exports. And we see that in some of the travel plans that we've seen our ministers and the Premier herself travel to.
Aileen, on top of that, I think that's a theme that you'll see throughout all of the mandate letters, is this expansion into an international outreach a little bit, as a response to, to the tariff and the trade situations. You'll start to see there are more missions, there are more encouragement for the ministries to reach outside the current jurisdictional boundaries and form partnerships, especially internationally.
Infrastructure and diversification, this was indirectly referred to in the 2023 mandate. But in 2025, there's a new emphasis on strategic infrastructure collaboration. So this in part will probably be trying to look at some of those national unity building projects and that, looking at a new pipeline and all that kind of fun stuff. And then, so we're just looking at actively building and diversifying our infrastructure and our industries.
And how to utilize the current legislative and tax system to remove barriers for international trade, especially for those items that are raw inputs generally that are exported, which now, instead of exporting the raw goods like forestry and metals, look for enrichment processes where we have the ability to develop or further develop them here and build things and enrich them here as a value add prior to export.
And then from an inclusion and social cohesion piece, this language has largely been lost in the 2025 mandate letters. We're really focused on, as I said at the beginning, it was branded under economic resiliency, right? And so we're really focused on economic growth outcomes and pragmatism there.
Thanks, Aileen and John. So I will just discuss the legal implications on the immigration mandates here. So from what Aileen and John have mentioned, Alberta is definitely seeking a lot more influence over immigration, particularly in how newcomers fit into our labor market. But the ultimate authority with immigration does rest with the federal government. So for example, the Temporary Foreign Worker Program, which is mentioned in the mandate letter, is federally controlled, which means Alberta can advise Ottawa on labor shortages, and they can also set provincial employment standards, but they can't override federal approvals. This, of course, creates a tension between economic priorities and the need to also respect humanitarian and diversity considerations. So trade missions and business incentives also carry risks if they're perceived as ineffective or harmful to any competitiveness within the province.
Yeah, thanks, Vince here. Tourism and sport.
Which is usually a fairly quiet and dormant portfolio over the past few decades. I mean, with a few touches on the tourism spot, usually is not a very controversial or difficult portfolio in terms of where we're at and where we're going. I think that's sort of turned itself and it's head upside down with the social issues that we'll talk about that fall into that. And the new minister being exceptionally competent and diligent in making sure that he's got these issues under control right now.
Yeah, so obviously a big piece that we're gonna see lots about in the coming months, I'm sure, is the Fairness and Safety in Sport Act. There's a direction to use all legal and constitutional tools to defend Alberta, athletes. But outside of that, outside of the social issues, we're still looking at expanding tourism, especially in the Rockies. So that's the word I was looking for, the All Season Resorts Act. Still working with Alberta to Travel Alberta, still trying to reach the goal of $25 billion in visitor spending. Interestingly, one of the pieces that they're looking at introducing is finding a way to ensure that visitors, quote unquote, contribute fairly via taxes and fees. I'm unsure as to how that is going to roll out and how that incentivizes tourists to come to the province, but we will see how that rolls out. And then we're also going to see a provincial bidding policy for international and national sports events.
Yeah, I think there's no surprise that when we look at this current government's agenda, it includes things like user fees and things that may be disproportionate for foreign and tourists to help boost their fair pay into the Alberta economy. I think it's also fair to say that when we talk about the jurisdictional reach or perhaps overreach or underreach, depending on where you sit on the issues, most of these ministerial mandate letters, you're going to see some sort of friction or pushback or challenges either federally or municipally. And in this case, you'll see that under Fairness and Safety in Sport, that they're putting together a new provincial bidding policy for international and national events. This comes as an immediate reaction to those municipalities and organizations that think that they should be able to put together applications for international events at the cost of taxpayers. And so this is, something that has boiled over in the community for about the last 2 or 3 years, especially when we looked at some of the major national and international events that they were looking at. So again, whether it's overreach, underreach, or just reaching in, pushing back on the feds on immigration, pushing into municipalities and local communities on bidding, you're going to see this as a theme on this next sort of round of legislative agenda.
So the key differences, if we flip to the next slide there, I think we've got them mixed up, so apologies for that. The list under 2023 should be under 2025 and vice versa, but regardless, 2023, the dedicated immigration stream tied to tourism and hospitality, less talk of starting new initiative programs in tourism, but more about implementing existing laws and policies. In 2025, there's obviously the focus on greater legal assertiveness, to the mandate to explicitly empowers the minister to invoke legal and constitutional tools to defend sports laws, which Benazir will speak to next. There's more a focus on transparency and public accountability for spending and sports events and tourism attraction. And then the whole idea of fair contribution by visitors. Next.
Yeah, thank you, Aileen. I believe I guess you and John have already kind of touched on this, but I can touch on the fairness and safety in sport piece. So this is just a general overview of the potential risks and tensions. And then here we get into legal implications of the Fairness and Safety in Sport Act. So this act is intended to protect the integrity of women's sports by requiring athletes in female divisions to confirm their sex at birth. This approach, of course, raises certain legal issues. The first one is privacy concerns. So collecting this type of personal information may conflict with Alberta's existing privacy laws, which require necessity and proportionality for personal information that an organization will collect. Second is the human rights piece. So excluding transgender women and girls may be seen as discrimination under the Alberta Human Rights Act. And the fact that this rule only applies to female divisions may also create charter equality concerns. So the legislation definitely faces potential legal challenges on multiple grounds. And I'll just pass it back to Aileen to discuss our next letter.
So Minister of Advanced Ed here, pretty straightforward. Looking at its credential recognition from workers from other jurisdictions, still implementing recommendations from the Foreign Credential Advisory Committee. And then the Fair Registration Practices Act amendment. The biggest piece and probably the most controversial piece out of this mandate letter is the teacher certification portion of looking at developing faster certification programs for degree diploma trade holders to become K-12 teachers. For those of you who haven't seen, the ATA has also released a statement addressing this concern as well. There's a big focus on exposure to trades and finding pathways and ensuring junior and senior high students have access to career fairs and new websites to broaden their pathways for career entrance, but there is a big focus on the trades and this new teacher certification opportunity. Next slide.
I don't think it comes as any surprise, given the discussions and rhetoric that's come from the current government over the last term or term and a half, and the premier in her previous party, about a funding following model, whether it's funding following patients or it's funding following students. It's an important part of the policy programs that the current government has looked at implementing over time, and so. Part of the post-secondary funding is to commission an expert panel to review those findings, to look at a funding follows to the students model in an effort to ensure that there's some sort of check, balance, or value, especially while continuing the research and operational funding for most of those universities and programs. There is, especially after events of recent, a continued renewal of looking at freedom of expression and academic expression within the post-secondary institutions. This comes as a part of the grassroots movement earlier in the premier's mandate and at annual general meetings, and the grumbling feelings sometimes on the ground from the base of the current government that institutions of higher learning are usually centrist or a little bit left-leaning in some respects, and so encouraging that freedom of expression and academic freedom is something that again, we would have expected to have seen to pop up on the radar. Looking at Professional Governments Act for consistent oversight. Always wanting to make sure that while the free market continues to operate, that there's proper oversight and governance in all of the professions that continue to operate in Alberta, and working with education and childcare for this non-repayable assistance for high school grads in shortage fields. Again, this is that alternative stream looking for, taking young adults and whether it's trades, whether it's advanced education in the post-secondary institutions of universities and colleges, and making sure they've got the tools to follow whichever stream best suits their abilities and their talents to contribute to a meaningful Alberta society. And as always, work with technology and innovation, especially by way of partnerships in a modernized intellectual property framework, to make sure taxpayers have the ability to commercialize or at least work and earn from publicly funded research. So taking those programs in universities and colleges that are funded with taxpayers' dollars and spinning them out through the existing university college incubator models in a way that there's licensing and other benefits back to the taxpayer. Ben, is there?
The big differences here, as John just mentioned, emphasis on system-wide governance, and protection of freedom of expression and academic freedom. We're really trying to align all of our systems with workforce needs right now. Looking at workforce gaps, trades parity, shortage field supports, that kind of thing. The explicit push for academic freedom legislation and IP ownership and that kind of thing signals stronger provincial oversight. So this is more of that reaching in type mentality. And then there's less emphasis on equity, multicultural access, but a stronger focus on pragmatism and economic return. Next. I'm going to skip this because we're running out of time. Education and childcare, and we see the teacher certification reform piece here. I think we will.
This is where we go back into understanding that especially as we see the current politics of the day and the friction between the ATA and the current government, the need for teachers, the need for continued teaching support staff, and looking at abbreviated processes the government is looking at to develop certification programs, to bring new bodies into the education and childcare system in a way that makes sense in their minds to support what would be a stronger education program. So shortened degree times, shortened trade professional certifications without having to go through the full Bachelor of Education program, 4 years at a post-secondary college or university rather to do that. Looking at instituting apprenticeship models at a high school level so that if you have an aptitude for woodworking or machining, that right out of high school and school trades, you can get straight into that program in a more weighted fashion. And looking at building resources for parents and kids to be able to find out what's available in terms of career opportunities and some career testing to look at aptitudes and say, okay, let's work with some industry partners to continue to outreach to those industry partners and finding pathways, starting at an early age, even in junior high, to move them into industry, as opposed to not everybody is going to have a 4-year or a 6-year university degree. And the idea that Albertans may be missing the boat by focusing on that. And we have a lot of great high-paying, high-quality contributors both to society and to our tax base that don't come from a university background. So getting in and getting early, to those that are in the system is part of this new focus and program.
The other things that we're still focused on here under education and childcare is the idea of parental choice and student protections. And so for those of you who are at Nonprofit Day, we spoke about this extensively in relation to the Alberta Human Rights Act and that kind of thing. But there's a theme of trying to ensure that parents have a say, but also trying to create more pathways for input from parents. And then through Bill 27 and the new library materials ministerial order, the idea of trying to protect the children is kind of filtered throughout this mandate letter as well.
And working back into earlier comments about reaching into education and school trusteeship and codes of conduct and protecting free speech is a part of this mandate letter, as well as looking at ensuring the continued parental choice on private, chartered, and other schools and home education programs, of course, ideologically aligned with the current government. And and with that, a continued focus away from some of the more social programming that was done under previous government, back into heavy financial literacy, STEM programs, and things of that nature, and life skills.
Ben, is there next slide? So we'll see key difference here. Obviously, childcare is now integrated into education, and they're kind of reframing that as part of the education spectrum. There's a focus on the establishment of a new federal child care arrangement because the current agreement is set to expire. That allows for provider parity. So this is the tension between the nonprofit daycare providers and the for-profit daycare providers. There's a focus on, again, establishing those new pathways to fast track certification, and then the protection of children and parental rights. So this is a focus. There's more provincial control here in 2025, and there's a governance tightening. We've kind of talked about some of this stuff already, so we'll go into Muni Affairs next. We're trying to get through this quick enough that we can leave room for questions, so see what we can accomplish. Minister of Muni Affairs, as Minister Williams said in the news yesterday, I think it was, we're getting back to the basics. So their work focused on trust and collaboration, municipal governance and accountability. So we're looking at, maintaining and building relationships with our municipal partners to try to mitigate potential conflicts between provincial policies and municipal bylaws. Developing a code of conduct for elected officials and senior staff to protect decorum and freedom of speech. Looking at strengthening the role of elected officials as decision makers over unelected staff when it comes to policy decision-making supervision. So this is the tension between the bureaucracy and the elected officials. Looking at a review of compensation and benefits for municipal officials and establishing salary disclosure to ensure accountability. And then obviously there's still the idea that municipalities have to remain viable to be able to deliver services. So there's a focus also on housing affordability and urban growth. There's tax and affordability measures. We're looking at ways to prevent unnecessary increases in in property taxes, and then looking at developing a strategy to protect from specialized non-primary residence taxes. We're kind of focused on building the Alberta dream here, right? How do we make sure that people are able to get into their own homes, enter into home ownership? We're still reducing the red tape. We're still trying to make this a viable, fast environment, but we want to make sure that people are able to own homes and go to work towards that dream, right? Next. So big differences here. We're looking at systemic reform for governance, elections, and accountability, right? We know the MGA is going to be amended again. That's coming in the spring likely. So we're going to see some of those changes. We're looking at trying to change permitting linked to housing and affordability, property tax changes, and then the urban development idea aligned with what is deemed Alberta values. And so there's some tension there about, whose Alberta values are we looking at? But there's this shift from 2023, which was more project focused and looking at provincial jurisdiction protection. What was the question? Is housing moving to Muni Affairs from Nixon? No, I would suggest it's not at this moment. It's not. There is a lot of direction for the ministries to work collaboratively with the other ministries, and Nixon's ministry was mentioned a lot throughout many of the mandate letters for that collaboration piece. So for now, it's staying in his ministry.
I think one of the main points in this is going to be water infrastructure and I mean, not necessarily as applicable for most of the participants on today, but water infrastructure and the shared jurisdiction between the province, the feds, the opening up of the Water Act. These are going to be instrumental for the province in the next session and a half. So I would definitely keep my eye on the pulse on those ones.
And that's your next one to you.
Thanks, Aileen and John. So I will just go over, I guess, the last few mandate letters here, so we still have time for questions. But basically, the infrastructure mandate includes expanding recovery and intervention facilities, establishing predictable funding formulas, and also accelerating priority projects such as arena and event centers. This mandate also involves managing provincial assets more strategically, advancing procurement reform, and also reviewing the health and social infrastructure and planning that to align with the demographic needs of Alberta currently. This ministry is actually also responsible for courthouse construction and then cross-ministerial work on economic development. So the key, I guess this kind of also is something we discussed earlier, the justice and economic development about the Minister of Infrastructure being responsible for courthouse development, procurement reform and advancing that in construction and services, and then property management. But I guess we'll discuss the key differences between 2023 and 2025. So in 2023, infrastructure was presented as an enabler of projects such as recovery builds, arenas, contract modernization, and workforce development. But in 2025, the focus of the ministry shifts towards infrastructure as a strategic capital planner and asset manager. So the attention is more on compassionate facilities, justice infrastructure such as the courthouse, procurement reform, and also maximizing the value from provincial assets.
Right. In our last session at the legislature, we watched compassionate care and other types of intervention policies be put into place. And so this is now the bouncing for the second procedural piece in order to put that infrastructure into play. Next.
Mhm. So the areas and tensions that come with this new mandate letter is that infrastructure, of course, carries visibility and political risks. So the arena and event center developments, they may face public criticism if they are perceived as subsidies potentially. A new capital funding formula may create disputes among different regions and institutions across the province. Procurement reform, it may face resistance if the implementation of it causes delays or inefficiencies. The increased provincial control over property could also conflict with local priorities. And the courthouse infrastructure project definitely creates legal and financial risks. And then moving on to the addiction recovery facilities, these may prompt political or charter challenges. And then the centralized oversight may also be criticized as limiting local autonomy. This is, of course, from a very high level, and the details that occur with these issues we'll know more about as the mandate letters are implemented throughout the province. The last one we have here is the mandate letter for the Ministry of Transportation and Economic Corridors. So of course, the Transportation and Economic Corridors mandate includes advancing Calgary's Blue and Green Line LRT projects. It also includes planning an Edmonton Airport rail connection and improving airport connectivity through international flights and regional access. This mandate also covers Indigenous partnerships in areas such as water management, prosperity sharing, and pipelines. The additional responsibilities that come in this mandate letter include expanding water infrastructure, highways and rural roads, enhancing safety, and then supporting economic corridors such as Highway 686 and major urban products like event centers. So we had split that into two slides. So the second part of what I discussed is just on here with our Indigenous and community partnerships, the water and infrastructure expansion, and then of course the economic development piece as well. The key differences in the 2023 and 2025 mandate letters is that the 2023 mandate emphasized planning and exploration with commuter rail feasibility and corridor agreements. There's P3 funding models and then hydrogen train innovation. But by 2025, the focus has definitely shifted to implementation with clear timelines for passenger rail and LRT projects, as well as a stronger emphasis on airport growth, Indigenous partnerships, procurement reform, and completion of major infrastructure. Unlike all the other mandate letters, it does come with potential risks and tensions in implementing this. So passenger rail and LRT projects could face cost overruns, delays, or disputes with municipalities and even the federal government potentially. The airport expansion also depends heavily on federal regulations and airline cooperation, which limits provincial control. The pipeline and corridors may face legal challenges which are related to jurisdiction, environmental law, and Indigenous rights. Highway 686 involves high costs and environmental concerns, and the Indigenous partnerships require meaningful consultation to avoid legal challenges. The water infrastructure part carries the risk of being complex and maybe encountering coordination or cost sharing disputes. The procurement reform faces or potentially could face internal resistance and delays. And lastly, the support from arena projects risks public criticism if seen as subsidies. This is something that we also touched on in the mandate letter for infrastructure. Okay, so now I just wanted to pass it along to the audience if they had any questions that Aileen, John, and I could answer.
There's a couple in the chat. So Jean, you asked about water. There's going to be an expansion of the Water for Life and eligibility requirements. This is purely speculation, but with the deficit going into the next budget, I would suspect that funding for Water for Life won't be increased. They're not gonna get rid of the fund, but I don't know that it will be increased. I'm not sure about eligibility requirements. I've not heard any conversation from the GOA about expanding that eligibility.
No, but I think water generally is on the table for discussion in a whole host of ways, especially surrounding the irrigation piece and water access rights. What's sort of been bantered around, and at least through committee once or twice, is just what that looks like on a go-forward basis. So there is some community consultations already happening during the Water Act revisitation, and so again, I think it's going to be a pretty hot topic, because even though that doesn't directly spill over into the Water for Life program, I think it will long term, and that'll probably be the second piece of it.
Then Elsie, you asked, wasn't it this government that just removed the codes of conduct from municipal government? Yes, they did. The idea now, by introducing a universal code of conduct, is that it limits the ability for individual municipalities to potentially limit freedom of speech and freedom of expression and that kind of thing. And so if the government introduces a universal one, then municipalities aren't able to create customized ones for that may infringe on personal rights.
Yeah, I think, Aileen, I think that's really the basis, is that there was always a concern that these codes would be weaponized amongst council members or used for potential conflicts rather than actually improving the behavior. And so by going through a unified code and putting together that, it does allow that additional sort of step of an independent ethics commissioner and ensuring broader freedom of speech, at least is the objective.
Karina, your point about it appears there's little support for rural or smaller communities, seems a higher support for Edmonton and Calgary. There's been a lot of tension and publicity of the tension between the province and Calgary and Edmonton. I think this is partially why we see some of the shift in narrative in the mandate letters. There was an article recently too that was combating the idea that Edmonton and the province have a divisive relationship. And so I think some of this is trying to combat that narrative. The smaller and rural communities are still this government's base, are still largely where their vote is coming from. So the support for those communities isn't going away. I think it's just there's a new emphasis in the mandate letters to try and combat some of this public narrative. On overreach into municipalities, John or Benazir, do you want to take that one?
Sure, Benazir, if you want to scroll back to the mandate letter on the municipalities, that would be helpful. I suspect that what we're going to see, Benazir, are you there? There we go. Just give her a second to pop back up here. So there, as Aileen sort of hinted at, there's been, a perceived disconnect between the major municipalities and the province, from everything from bike lanes to the processing of permits. And so trying to align the provincial policies and the provincial objectives with municipal bylaws is something that I think is still going to be on the on the forefront of the agenda. And I really think that looking at how the province has started to weigh into the bike lane debate recently is the perfect example of an of an exercise of overreach, or at least should have an idea of whether or not this is overreach. I mean, some will say it is, and some will say it isn't. Of course, welcome to the world of politics. But the idea that municipalities should stay in their own lane, and the province should stay in its lane, and the feds should stay in its lane, is one that continues to pop up in everything from elected official code of conduct, and so the province is mandating these types of things for municipal governance. So, should the province mandate a bill on mandatory codes of conduct and an ethics commissioner specific, towards that for accountability under what was Bill 50 at the time? Many in the municipal world would think that this is a gross overreach into local governance. And the province says, well, look, we don't like the way you're governing yourselves and we're responsible for you. So let's talk about that. And this also rolls itself back into how we had the intercollaborative framework projects between neighboring municipalities, which maybe leans a little bit more towards an appropriate provincial oversight piece. But things like unelected staff and strengthening the role of elected officials, if you watch the trends that started to come out through Ontario over the last 2 or 3 years, while we're not there, you can also see it sort of bubbling through on that freedom of speech, on that campus for advanced education, on the conflicts of interest piece for municipalities as well.
There's also
And bike lanes. I love my bike lanes.
there's also going to be the tension, obviously, if you're looking at limiting, municipalities already have limited incomes generating sources, and if we're looking at limiting property tax increases and that kind of stuff too, there needs to be a mechanism thrown in that will help mitigate the unintended consequences there that comes from the reduction in funding potentially, right? And so these are things that we'll have to keep our eyes on, especially as more and more gets downloaded to the municipalities. Given the lane conversation, do you feel this is what is coming through on the tourism and sport mandate letter?
No, I don't think it shows up at all on the tourism mandate letter, other than creating a strong foundation. I think that focus continues to be on tourism. It continues to be on implementing the the gender and sport regulations and looking at some of the hiccups that are going to be caused through that process because it's highly invasive. Should it be challenged, and the idea on how we're going to protect the information of those that are participating. I think their hands are full, and I suspect that you're mostly going to see that through the municipal side.
If you mean lane as in like broader, like municipality staying in the municipal lane and the province staying in the provincial lane, I think, invoking the notwithstanding clause and that kind of stuff is the province trying to keep people in their lanes. They're trying to prevent federal overreach. They're trying to, right? And
Absolutely.
this is
Yeah, if that's the lane we're talking about, you bet it is. This is going back to the ideological, foundation of the current government that says it's unfair to have transgendered, non-female born cis females or cis men play in female sports. And so going through that process, this is really saying, hey, feds, back in your lane. And I think most of the mandate letters have some hint as to either, an influence into the municipal side or back into the federal side, and using all constitutional, et cetera, just is a reinforcement of how strong that is.
Got time for one or two more questions. Otherwise, we will wrap up. Anybody else? No. All right. Well, thank you everybody for joining us for this last hour. Again, we'll make sure that we send out the PowerPoints, slides and the recording. If you have any questions, please don't hesitate to reach out. Otherwise, have a great rest of your week.
Thanks all. Have a great day.